Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Breakfast Special.
Welcome to your breakfast special with me, Audrey Siek. The countdown to GE2025 is underway with nomination day coming up in just 2 days on April 23rd and polling day set for May 3rd. And as much as this election will play out on the ground through walkabouts, rallies, house visits, it's also happening in a big way online. We're looking at what's called a phy-gital election, where physical and digital campaigning are coming together like never before. But with this comes both opportunities and risks. AI tools are becoming more accessible and powerful, so the risks of misinformation, manipulation, and divisive content are higher than ever, so much so that Singapore has new laws in place for the first time this GE to ban digitally altered content that misrepresents candidates. Now, to help us unpack all of this, how it's likely to affect GE 2025, the strategies of our political parties, and what we should watch out for on social media, we're joined by Joel Lim, host of The Political Prude. That's a podcast that aims to make Singapore politics less intimidating and easier to consume for young adults. Joel, welcome to Money FM. It's great to have you with us this morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, I know you've been very busy, so we really appreciate the time. And let's start with the big picture, Joel, okay? So this GE 2025 is gearing up with both physical and digital campaigning happening kind of side by side. So how significant is this digital space this time around? How has online political engagement changed from the last election?
Absolutely. The digital space is more significant than ever. I mean, the last election, of course, it was during COVID-19, so it was a predominantly online election. However, I think that more people today are on social media. More people today are able to access different platforms like Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. So I do think that online space is now the battleground for attention, right? We see a lot of parties absolutely pushing out content as well. The production value this year has really gone up. Every single party, you can kind of see their strategy and resources being invested into the production quality of the content that they are pushing out in order to reach, voters and their audiences as well. So for me, I think when I look at the politicians, I think they also understand the importance of building a public brand or public persona, right? Since the last 5 years, we see a lot of them, taking the period of time in between the elections to build their own communities and for also the people of Singapore to understand who they are as individuals so that when it's time for GE, it's not just during those 9 days of campaigning whereby they're able to convince someone. It is really based on the track record that they have. So a lot of them are building on the past 5 years of work as well.
Yeah, so would you see digital campaigning as kind of like a 24/7 platform for them to continue pushing out their message versus, if you're on the ground for 9 days, that's not that much time.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the past, it's kind of one way whereby the candidates have to come to you, whether it's, knocking your doors or meeting you at the hawker centers. But today, I think a lot of voters, it's the other way around now, where they go to the profiles of all these different parties and candidates. And these pages now become that first digital introduction and also where people form their first impressions and opinions of, whether it's party or candidate.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the messaging in a little bit, but I want to talk about the news now. We've seen Singapore's election rules tightening around online content. We've seen new laws banning deepfakes of candidates. From what you're observing, what are the biggest digital threats to Singapore's GE this year? And can regulation kind of keep up with the speed and sophistication of AI-generated content?
I mean, personally, I think the speed at which AI has been developing has been mind-blowing.
Yeah.
I'm both in awe as well as a little bit scared about what that means for us. The intent behind the laws that have been introduced, I think that's what is important, right? I think firstly, and the most important part of it is that it's to preserve trust in our electoral process. And I think that is important. However, the reality of, laws when it comes to technology is really that they tend to be responsive and therefore there is, by definition, a lag. And I think what's more important here is also for us to think about whether or not we are able to be media literate and be able to identify, what are some of these AI-generated content.
Yeah.
When we're talking about AI, I don't just mean that, politicians who use, for example, ChatGPT to craft a speech. I think, that's not the dangerous part. The real danger is really in deepfakes or, creating misinformation or misrepresentation of different candidates or parties.
Yeah. So, we've already seen these manipulated images and videos surface here in the lead up to GE 2025. How can voters protect ourselves, against being misled by such content then?
Well, I think one of the things that we must be able to identify when it comes to generated content is being able to first look at the sources, right? Are they established sources? Are they sources that you trust? Whether it's organizations, people, content creators, look at those pages. Are they people who have had like a established track record whereby you can go to them and say, yes, this is a trustworthy source?
Yeah.
Or is it a new page that came out of nowhere? Or is it a page that perhaps is modeled after established platforms? I think we need to be discerning in that way. That's the first one. The second one is perhaps having a litmus test of our own, asking, well, if it's making me feel a certain way, like, can I be more cautious? Can I be skeptical rather than reactive? I think that's one tip that I always give to my peers as well.
Okay. So AI isn't just being used for deepfakes. So let's talk about the positive side of things. It's also powering campaign strategies, targeted ads, data-driven messaging. How do you see AI shaping the way parties and candidates engage with voters this GE?
Absolutely. So on my podcast, I managed to interview some of the politicians as well. And one of them specifically said, in my preparation for the elections, I actually used ChatGPT and DeepSeek to kind of understand the big picture of how my party has contributed to the Singapore landscape. So he basically, I guess, used their research and also his own data points and asked it to give him like a better understanding of, how he has contributed to the Singapore story. I think that's quite cool, that, they are able now to do things at a much quicker pace and at the same time also, use this messaging in their own public campaigns as well.
Right.
Because ultimately when Singaporeans are voting, they also want to see report cards, for example. They want to know what have you really done. And that's one way, whereby AI has been able to help communicate that to the parties themselves, right? We can see that internally. One of the perhaps positive things that I think that candidates and parties can do is really to understand how to craft different messages to different sectors of society.
Yeah.
For example, I think all marketing people have done this, right? Like write me a caption that appeals to Gen Z or write me a caption that appeals to the millennials. And I think that the AI tools will be able to help, draft a certain messaging that would appeal to those different demographics. And I think that if parties are savvy, they will at least try that out and see, what does the generative language models give you.
Yeah. So speaking of messaging that you were talking about, on the campaign front, what are some of the key communication angles or digital messaging trends that you've noticed so far from our major political parties?
Yep. So I think for one, because we are in an election, most of them will be grounding their key messaging onto their slogans or their manifestos. I think that's the key thing that we need to understand when it comes to, public messaging through an election. So for example, when we look at the PAP, their messaging is, we're in a new world, we have new faces to introduce, and we have a new resolve here. For the WP, theirs is all about stepping up and working for Singapore. For, the SDP, for example, they're talking about thriving, not just surviving. So we do see these different content pieces and key messages, bleeding through the content that they're putting out as well. But if we're talking about more of a big picture perspective, I think a lot of these parties and candidates are also building off persona-based content and persona-based messaging. What does the party stand for? What does each individual candidate stand for? I think a lot of them are being a lot more explicit about, the things that matter to them.
Yeah, so casting your mind back to GE 2020, Joel, I'm going to put you on the spot here. For the social media tactics that you've seen, what really worked and what didn't work? Do you remember any of that?
In the GE 2020? Well, I think the parties or candidates that could utilize video back in GE 2020 were able to capture the imagination. I remember a lot of the content that went viral during that period were through video content.
Okay.
And I think that translates to this year, whereby now you're seeing campaign videos that are so mind-blowingly good. When I'm watching some of the content pieces that were being put out, I was like, wait, am I watching a movie trailer? What's happening here? I think it's reflective of how, the parties after that election 5 years ago took time to sit down and say what worked, what didn't work. And I think all of them, probably looked at the data points and said, I think we need to look at production quality.
Okay. And are podcasts also the new battleground this time around, especially as we've seen it becoming a factor in the U.S. elections? Is it the same case here in Singapore?
Absolutely. I think when we look at how things have changed in the last 5 years. Well, when COVID was here, the podcast exploded, right?
Yep.
Because everybody now needed, new forms of entertainment and new forms of content. When we look at the US elections that just concluded last year, a lot of the conversation post-election was about podcasts, actually. And people were discussing whether or not, Kamala Harris's decision to not go onto several of these large podcasts like Joe Rogan's podcast, for example, contributed to her loss eventually. Well, we don't really know. I think it's obviously a multitude of factors at play here. But the fact that so many people, including very formal institutions, talking about podcasts as a legitimate factor kind of lends to the idea that, hey, I think, the landscape has changed.
Yeah.
The fundamental thing here is really that politicians will go where the audience is, right? And I do think that where the audience is today is podcasts, because we see that shift even in popular culture, right? Whereby, the era of the Ellen Show is no longer the big thing. More people are excited to go listen to celebrities or public figures on podcasts like, for example, Jay Shetty's podcast or Alex Cooper's Call Her Daddy podcast or Joe Rogan's podcast. I think that's where, the public interest lies as well, that people now prefer longer form content when it comes to public figures and the interviews that they give.
Yeah. So speaking of going to where the audience is, we've also seen a rise of influencers recently. And this engagement with influencers, how big of a factor is this?
Again, it's all about reaching the public, right? And the thing about the online spaces is that everyone has a curated audience. And that's also one of the reasons why politicians go onto podcasts. Because while they're building their own audiences through their own parties' pages or their own personal pages, a lot of the times they are not reaching out to different demographics out there, Each podcast builds their own audience base, right? Even in Singapore, when we talk about the different podcasts that talks about current affairs, you have, of course, the Political Prude, you have the Daily Catch-Up, you have Yala Bat, all these different shows, while they're talking about the same thing, their audience profiles are very different. And therefore, that's why politicians go onto these different shows to reach people that potentially do not follow them, right? They're tapping on their audience base. When it comes to influencers, it's really the same thing. Of course, a lot of the public don't follow influencers because of their political views, right? It's really because of perhaps, various niche interests, whether it's maybe a particular sport or a particular lifestyle or, just because they look a certain way. It doesn't matter, right? Each one of them has their own audience base. And I think the smart thing to do really is to engage these people, because at the end of the day, who's voting? Everyone is, right? And you can't just say that I'm going to engage only with the politically engaged who follow me. You really have to reach out to all sectors of society. In the past, that's going to the coffee shops, it's going to community centers. Today, it's really, reaching out to the various sectors through different means.
Yeah. You're right. Okay, so what advice would you give Singaporeans when it comes to navigating, the flood of election content online? We have so much to pick from, right? From podcasts to actual news shows. How do we manage all of this? You talked about being discerning, but also how can we participate responsibly in digital conversations?
Well, when I interviewed Dr. Gillian Koh on my podcast, she gave this one tidbit that I thought was a great piece of advice. She said, have a mixed diet, right? And I think that's a great thing, because when it comes to elections, you should not only have one source of truth, You really need to be able to understand what are the different perspectives on a particular issue and what the different parties standing for, what are candidates standing for. On the other side of things, I do think that, we need to perhaps stay alert not alarmed. I think that's the key motto for myself here. Obviously you're going to be seeing a lot of content, either clickbait content or, content that's taken out of context, or even, deep fakes.
Yeah.
The thing here is really to be able to be looking at different content and asking yourself, like, is this meant to provoke me? Is this meant to inform me? And how do I then navigate and manage that? Personally, how I'm approaching the elections is that I'm going to be following a variety of different sources, even those that I particularly may not always agree with, just for myself to have a little bit more nuance. And hopefully all of us can, participate in this election process with vigilance, and kindness as well.
Yes.
I think that's very important.
Yeah, so it's clear that the digital space is going to be crucial alongside the on-the-ground action this GE. And we're looking forward to be hearing more on this space as Joel will be joining us again for Money FM's GE Tonight series, giving us sharp, timely insights into the social media landscape this election. That special starts airing from 7 p.m. this Wednesday on Nomination Day. So you wouldn't want to miss it. Thank you so much, Joel, for breaking all of this down for us. And we're so excited to continue the conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Joel. That was Joel Lim, host of The Political Prude. And that was your breakfast special on Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.